We had thought we would give the floor to Shawan Jabarin again as the great witness of the situation. We would like for him to say a few words on what he heard this morning, how he feels about the conclusions that were given, about the contributions. And we wanted to ask him to take the floor so that he could say a few words about the debate this morning.
Oui.
Thank you again. And I felt that the common things between the two main sessions were the fear, that there is now a fear and deep fear when it comes to the freedom of expression, when it comes to the exercising, the democratic values and principles. This brings me to the Israeli strategy these days. They established a special ministry just to deal with the fear, to distribute the fear, and to deepening the fear over the world against individuals, institutions, using different means of that. Just you can imagine that France established a special ministry just to go after individuals over the world, those they criticize the government of France. Israel they did, and part of that is security officers, expertise, international relations, media officers, and they have millions, tens of millions of dollars in their hands to do that. This is an issue, and I think this conference is a very, very important one to react on the fear atmosphere. That's, I think, important. And I suggest this conference can be like in a public level, more than, in a public level, maybe in the media, to have the speakers, to have them like on TV, speaking and addressing the same subjects and the topics that they are doing. I like, the way of organizing this and also the message in this conference. And I think the new generation needs this one, and the question here and the main challenge before AFSP is how they can, address this message to the young generation and to the public in general, not just in closed rooms, because it's a very, very important one. Thank you.
Une première question.
We have a question for Pascal Boniface. In 2003, you wrote a book entitled Can One Criticize Israel? 15 years later, we are at a conference on this very same theme. Shouldn't we be asking a more direct question? Can one sanction and condemn Israel? Why is this question not dominating the debate? Well, I would say that firstly there is a problem with freedom of expression, yes, and what you just said in conclusion, Mr. Jabarin, shows that we do have a problem of expression because we do have the right to criticize Israel. It is a right that we have. But the problem is that when we do so, we have problems, more problems than when we criticize Palestinians in France, for example. So it was, there is this right, there is a right to criticize theoretically, but there are practical consequences when we criticize or oppose Israeli policies. Now, we are in a conflict which is very long-standing. We know the international law, and we have never talked about sanctions. When can we sanction the state? What we have been doing is letting protagonists of the conflict deal with these issues themselves. And this is not what we did for Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example. That is not the attitude that we had. So yes, there is a double standard. And so what I'm saying is not very funny, but it's quite ironic in a sense. Those who say that, yes, you can criticize Israel, then attack you violently if you do so. So it's quite exceptional in France, this situation. And this conflict, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, is one of the only ones where sanctions are not mentioned when it comes to violations of international law, and that's true.
Alors, sur les questions pour le mal.
Now, for the questions on the French problem, I will read these questions. They are for everyone. When it comes to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, how have the French institution evolved? How come our President Macron does not listen to our movement? Can one say that France, or at least its media and its politicians, can help us in the fight against colonialism? This question is about the independence of France. And I would like to know, the person asking the question says, if the question that we are asking in this conference was asked at the Senate and the National Assembly. Can one oppose the Israeli policy? Okay, many questions here. Who would like to address part of the question? So, for example, how come Emmanuel Macron doesn't listen to us? Go ahead, you have the floor. Two things. Firstly, on impunity. I would like to remind you of the Goldstone report. This report was drawn up after the invasion of Gaza 2008 and 2009. And one of the conclusions of the report, going beyond the accusations that were expressed, and accusations of crimes against humanity and crimes of war, one of the conclusions in this report was that impunity fuels the pursuit of this conflict, even if I don't agree with the term of conflict, because there is no symmetry here. So the real question is, what are we doing? What is our responsibility here? What is our responsibility as the civil society to effectively tackle this impunity? Because this is what fuels the pursuit of the conflict. Now, on this point, the French policy has, for a long time, promoted international law and has participated in its establishment. And this is what de Gaulle said in 1967. The occupation will create a resistance, and we will say that this resistance is terrorist, and then there will be a repression against it. This policy was completely changed, radically changed, at the end of the Chirac era. And since, we have been continuing to buck the trend. And this manifests clearly through many elements. And clearly by the lack of a fight against impunity. And this is true in the European context. In the European Union, clearly there is a will to unlink the economy from politics. The trade relationship, which is flourishing between Israel and the European Union, is presented as being not related or not linked with the political aspect and the political role played by Israel in the region. But we go even further on two fronts. Firstly, when it comes to negotiations and the bilateral talks. Again, this is the only conflict where we have this face-to-face negotiation between the occupier and the occupee and the occupied. And this is as if we had left. And on this issue, Laurent Fabius had made a suggestion. And we had been talking to him for years as a movement of solidarity. And he had realized that the approach that was used until then did not work. The bilateral approach did not allow us to impose international law. So on one side, Palestinians told us, okay, we accept the international law and we'd like to discuss the modalities. And the Israelis would say, let go of international law and we will invent a new category called a very generous offer. And Emmanuel Macron actually calls and brands this as a courageous act, an act of courage when he talks about Netanyahu. Now, Fabius wanted to go against this. He wanted to have a schedule, also officially recognize the state of Palestine if the negotiations did not work, and an international framework. However, the subsequent cabinets did not accept what Fabius had established, and they are now asking the two parties to negotiate bilaterally. Dominique, you were talking about how Netanyahu was invited in July, and Emmanuel Macron said, we have to develop relationships with Israel on all fronts, from a technological point of view, and this, of course, includes the military complex. So he's talked about developing relations with Israel and re-legitimizing Israeli policies through what the officials have been asking for a very long time. And it's a fight against BDS, and notably from a cultural point of view. And now what we are doing is exactly the contrary of fighting against impunity, whereas our citizens are calling for that fight against impunity. I would like to be brief. I am not comfortable with this written questions system because there's kind of a filter between us. And then we have a synthesis of the synthesis. And I would say that for the next session, we should have a more modern system. It's been around for a while, which is that people in the room can just ask questions to the speakers and then the speakers can answer. And if the room had been more full with young people, this system would definitely not work, I have to say. Secondly, this question, which was posed in a almost trivial manner, is actually central. The question about being a loser, losing, or winning. It all depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about our fight against Israeli policies, we are fighting against the most far right-wing government Israel has had in years. Annexation policies, they are calling into question democratic values and principles, repression against civil society, and so on and so forth. Secondly, it is clear that this government is taking advantage of a very generous situation. The American administration is very strongly supportive. The Arab world is led by Mohammed al-Salman, who is allied with Israel against Iran. And then there is this regional chaos. Look at what happened just this weekend. I would challenge anyone even Pascal, who knows a lot about this, to tell us more about what is underlying. Is this an attempt to completely make the region explode, or is it a way for Netanyahu to use this as fear-mongering in order to guarantee the unity of the country? And so, yes, even in France, the CRIF organization is on full attack mode. All of this is true. However, let us not forget that all of these people are highly isolated in the general opinion, the general public, globally. Not just in France, globally. They are really isolated, and the general public actually expresses contempt for these opinions. And we can't do what others can. We can't get rid of Trump. But what we can do is make sure that the opinion in France can really be expressed. It's not just convincing people, not even convincing people. It's helping people to really express their opinion. And I would say that BDS is the best weapon. Because BDS... yeah, of course, but we don't have to agree, says the member of the audience. Yes, I'm saying, says Dominique Vidal, that this is the best weapon that we have right now for those who oppose Israeli policies to express their political opinion. And the best argument is that Netanyahu considers us to be a strategic threat. This is our best push. And I'd like to add, and I'll stop there, what Antoine Comte said to us before is very important. Not only does BDS works, it works in France. It works massively when it's well done, of course, and then when you put the conviction that is needed. Of course, things need to be done according to the public opinion in France and the trends. But also, let us not forget that justice does not, or the legislative system, rather, does not ban BDS. Antoine Comte said it to us before. And I'd like to add that there are hundreds of actions, of BDS actions, which are not brought into court. And of course, this is, of course, a very positive signal, because it means that tribunals and courts don't want to get involved in this sort of lawsuits. And this means that it is now time for us to move on to a full attack mode, no longer on the defensive. We don't have to continue reacting and being or responding to what we are being accused of. No, we have to be on the offensive, and we have to defend our right to criticizing Israeli policies. And that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism under any shape or form. And the more we work with BDS, and the more we will have to be vigilant on this so that there are no potential drifts. Now, Macron, if you can tell me what the policy is in the Middle East, then you are a genius, I have to say, because for now he has been doing really random things. He speaks about a two-state solution, then he says Jerusalem as the capital of the two states, then there is a vote to condemn the decision made by Trump, which is, of course, which is important, it has its importance, but on the other hand, he fully expresses his love, if I may say so, to Netanyahu. I think that we should not try to decrypt Macron. I think we need to fight for him to listen to us. That's what's important. And I believe that we do have the possibility of being heard. It is an issue of freedom of expression. It is an issue of international law. And the president of France, well, I'm not talking about François Hollande because he was an exception, but the president of France must respect a few principles, and we have to help him do so. Macron must express the opinion of the French people and not the opinion of such and such lobbies. Just in a few words, it's all about how we fight. If the movement, if the solidarity movement is stronger than pro-Israeli lobbies, then it will be supported. And I think that for now, officials think that the pro-Israeli movement is stronger, and that's why it is more supported. And we need to really buck that trend. We have to make sure that we are visible, and more visible and stronger. And I think that the AFPS needs to reach out to the new generation. It needs to go into schools. It needs to go into high schools, middle schools, and universities. We have to really reach out and open up if we want to move. I would say that in our organization, we fight for BDS under all its shapes. Our organization is UJFP, which is the Jewish-French Union for Peace. I have a comment here on anti-Semitism. For us, Zionism was fueled by anti-Semitism. Herzl used to say to anti-Semitic leaders, we have the same interest. We want the Jewish community to leave Europe. And you said that all xenophobic parties in Europe are pro-Israeli. And this is for a simple reason, and I'd like to add on this. It's because the Jewish community is considered to be non-European. It cannot be integrated in Europe, and this is why they are considered as pariahs, and these far right-wing movements want to get rid of them. I would like to first say that if we look at the goal of this conference, it is also to convince people who are not completely convinced of our position. So I have a question on anti-Semitism. I think that we will have to continue using this word anti-Semitism because it is the popular word which is used, especially by people who we have yet to convince. Now, I have a question on this notion. Now, I think that it is dangerous for us to accept this term as being representative of racism against Jews. Why? Because we are equating the belonging to the Jewish community to belonging to a race. And it means that we are associating a race with a religion, which is quite dangerous. This also rips the Arabs from their Semitic roots because they are excluded from anti-Semitism, which means that it seems although as if the Jewish community have the monopoly of anti-Semitism. And I know this is not the goal of our conference, but I wanted to ask this question nonetheless. Fabienne, Messica, you would like to say a few words? Now, I don't think that we are the specialists of racism and of anti-racism, but there is no such thing as a perfect notion. Secondly, the issue of race, well, some groups are fighting for the reintroduction of the concept of race because they consider themselves as having a racial belonging. And these are notions and concepts that don't exist in France. They exist in the United States, for example, but race does not exist in France as a concept officially. And notably, for example, they exist in the United States for affirmative action, among other things. But eventually, words become what they are branded as, what they mean. And concepts and notions have a history. We can't completely forget that history, and I don't think that it would be very useful to stop using anti-Semitism in our struggle. especially given the fact that there are other terms such as anti-Judaism or Judeophobia, which refers to the anti-Judaism, which is of a more religious nature, if you will. And this is the notion and the concept which is used by different organizations. So I don't think that we should call this concept into question. I think it would be quite perilous. I think that it would only lead to worse things. And I think, and I said this before, some people talk about Negrophobia in France, about the racism against the Rom community, about Islamophobia, and we are not here to talk about the validity of these notions and these concepts. These words are being used, and there is a dimension to racism which is universal, but there are also experiences from a social point of view which is quite specific. And that's the reality today. So, for example, when we talk about colonialist racism, it's not general racism. We are talking about racism in a context. Do you accept that this exists? I do, because I believe that within colonialism, there are elements of a very specific type of racism. When people, when Black people, for example, say, okay, there is a discriminatory attitude which is specific to our experience as former slaves, I, of course, admit it, because it's true. It's their experience as a people. So I think that it's not a good idea to refuse the specificity of these different experiences of racism on behalf of the universality of the fight against racism. They are not mutually exclusive. Thank you, Fabienne. Thank you. Yes, these semantic issues are not always very helpful, are they? Now, sir, for your question. Now, I would just like to say that sometimes we don't have questions. We may have comments. But firstly, a question. Dominique Vidal said that BDS was the fundamental way of action, an offensive action against Israeli policies, if I understood him correctly. Now, I am not against this, but there is an underlying question that we did not stress. We seem to not be doing what is necessary when it comes to the French authorities and European authorities concerning the suspension of the agreements and exonerating them when we don't massively campaign for the suspension of agreements with Israel, and notably the agreement between the European Union and Israel. And I would just like to add one thing. What the solidarity movement needs is a majority movement in our country, and it is not a majority movement. It is not a massive movement, no matter what you believe. And I'm not talking about, I think that boycott leads us to discussions that are endless, but the issue of suspending the agreements with Israel is an issue of international law. It complies with the principles of the French Republic. It complies with the European Union. And it is an issue that can really unify the opinion. And this is what I'm fighting for. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. And we did not try to make it any shorter, I'd like to assure you. Thank you. Yes, one can perfectly be for suspending the agreements between the European Union and Israel and also defend sanctions. We can also do this within the broader movement of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This is a demand coming from Palestinian NGOs. They made this request in 2005, and they asked the community, the international community, to take it on board. I completely agree with what you said, sir, on the relevance of having a very clear demand which holds our authorities accountable. I'm completely on board with what you just said. However, on a more personal level, I would make sure that that request be put into the larger context of BDS, and taking into account the fact that BDS is about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And when we talk about boycott, of course, this leads to a discussion on what should be boycotted, under what shape. Are we talking about Israeli goods in general? Are we talking about goods that were made in the settlements? Of course, this is a very vast area. But your thirst for efficiency in order to convince the opinion, I would say that it's very legitimate, and I completely agree with it. And it leads us to thinking how we can use BDS. Did anyone want to take the floor? Isabelle? Yes, I just wanted to say that I agree with our member of the audience. I would say that contrary to what was just said, we are the majority, actually, according to the polls. Now, of course, when you ask the opinion of the French, it seems that they are more pro-Palestinian than anything else. And they talk about an injustice that needs to be repaired. And maybe they're just caught up in their life, so they don't have time to act politically. But what I would add, to pick up on what Dominique said, in order to be in full attack mode, we have to use different paths. We can't focus on one point. And, for example, if we talk about the campaign for Salah Hamouri, Salah Hamouri is both French and Palestinian. He's currently incarcerated, and he's already spent 7 years of his life in jail. It is fundamental for us to support him and his family. He represents something that's very important to us. And of course, the fact that we compare Marwan Barghouti to Mandela is also very important, because it gives this universalist aspect to the struggle. Marwan Barghouti needs to be defended. We need to have the campaign. And these, of course, are examples, are gateways of how we can wage this battle. Now, we also have figures about how Israel legalizes in a certain way the annexation of Palestinian territories, because, for example, at the OECD, they include whatever figures they have, and notably trade figures coming from the settlements. So, of course, this is a war that needs to be waged on all the fronts. Okay, given that it is almost 1, or it is past 1, actually, we would like to take the last question. Pierre Stamboul, it seemed that you had an important question to ask. or asked already. Rony, would you, on anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism? I seem to have forgotten the question. I'm really sorry. I think that Fabienne already answered the question. I don't think I need to add anything to that. Okay. Maybe we could have a last question. Okay, so we're going to take the couple of questions. I am Melaj Abdelkader, and I am a member of AFPS. A very simple question, straightforward. Rather than use anti-Zionist as a word, why don't we just use anti-colonialism? Everyone would understand it, and that way we can't be generalized or put into categories and labels. I would also like to suggest one thing about demonstrations. Far-right parties were able to organize demonstrations at the same time, simultaneously, in different cities in Europe. Can't we do the same thing for this fair cause by being efficient? Could we not organize such a thing? Another suggestion, if I may. Currently, we don't really speak about this issue in an objective manner in our schools. Could we not, for example, have conferences in high schools? This would have many advantages because it would shed light on the issue and avoid erroneous interpretations within the youth. And for BDS, I wanted to ask whether we could not ensure more means to defend our fellow activists who are being brought to court and sued. And notably, we could maybe collect funds, resources, because I went to the trial for our friend Richard, and I would say that we could have allocated more means and more resources as the Solidarity Movement. Okay, one last question, and then we will be wrapping this up. Two questions. Firstly, I wanted to pick up on what you said about Macron. I would say that what we are doing here today is awareness raising and encouraging our troops, and I think that that's how we get results. I would like to refer to a report by the LDH, which is an organization for human rights in France. There was a meeting with the special advisor to Macron on human rights in the Middle East, and I suppose that she knows what she's talking about. And in the response that she gave to the delegation from this organization, she said that there would be a clarification on this confusion between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and that the government will be more, let's say, will have a more firm position when it comes to Netanyahu. Is this just words? Well, in this meeting, she did commit to defending Salah Hamouri. She did commit to giving a new definition of anti-Semitism, so maybe that there's a possibility of evolution there. Now, secondly, I would like to talk about the definition of anti-Semitism by the IHRA. It is a very dangerous text, but I think that it should be analyzed in depth by legal experts. When I look at the text, it seems that, so quoting the text, however, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. This is a quote from the text, which means that this content can be used to our advantage. This is a document which was adopted at the European Parliament, only 100 votes against. So it was a landslide win. It was suggested by the Socialist Group, by Christian Dems. And of course, it stays a very dangerous document because it makes sure that we continue condemning BDS actions, and it is dangerous because some countries want it to be transposed in their national legislation. Okay, just for the last question. Yes, for the definition of the IHRA. This is a testimony to how sensitive this issue is. For the lobby who drafted this text, it was impossible to clearly say, any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. So they went the other way. But even if you look at it from a semantic point of view, what does it mean to say criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country? Let's imagine that we criticize Switzerland, well known for their violations of human rights. How can I make sure that criticisms are similar? That the criticism leveled to a country such as Switzerland or Luxembourg is similar than the one addressed to Israel. So as you can see, there's quite some amount of finesse in these manipulations, which means that we need to, once again I insist, move on to full attack mode. So I would not go into a debate on anti-Zionism. It is not the focal point of our problems and our issues. And if we don't respond to them, however, if we don't respond to them, then we will have even less leeway. So we have to really wage this in an offensive manner, especially when our enemies force us to do so. I was at the AFPS for 20 years, and we didn't talk about anti-Zionism that much. But now that the President of the Republic decided to equate anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, then we can no longer be silent. We have to fight, and we have to fight visibly and offensively. Thank you. Yes. Now, the concept of anti-colonialism, one of the members of the audience talked about it. I would say that it should be highlighted. It is a colonialist issue. And we know that it is a violation of human rights. Now, thank you, everyone.